Support for Trifles comes from the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/Trifles. And one special note, if you're a Patreon supporter of Trifles, you now have the ability to get our episodes without ads. Just make sure you listen to us on Patreon.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the stone was Mazarin, the carbuncle was blue, and the mane was lion, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about what kind of chemistry experiments Sherlock Holmes was running? Or what a yeggman is? Or why Holmes's index was sorted haphazardly?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 297, The Arcadia Mixture. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast, where we look into some of the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you sufficiently mixed?
Not only am I mixed, but I am stirred and shaken.
Fantastic. We should enjoy a couple of adult beverages while we discuss this topic.
Oh, excellent.
It would seem like, if as long as we're talking about pipe tobacco, it would seem like there should be a good accompanying spirit that goes along with this. What would be your choice?
Oh, well, it would have to be a single malt. I can't imagine anything better. Peaty single malt complements Latakia quite well.
Yes. Well, you definitely do not want the smoky kind of scotch. But a peaty whiskey is absolutely in order. And we're going to be discussing, just so you know, the famed Arcadia mixture that Watson used, as well as the connection to J.M. Barrie. How do these things all connect together? Well, you'll have to stay tuned and hear the discussion. The show notes for this episode, where we will share any links or other additional material that you need to learn, can be found at ihose.co/trifles297, all lowercase, ihose.co/trifles297, and that will take you directly to our website. You can find this link in the show notes in whatever podcast app you happen to be using. And there you can also find links to support us on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can become a supporter of Trifles. It helps us put out the show, helps us produce, prepare, research, hosting all of the files, keeping the website active, our email list active, etc. It all helps to keep the show going. Also wanted to point out that, just a reminder, we should have thought of this a long time ago. We are now making our episodes available on Patreon without ads, just for our Patreon supporters. So make sure you check that out. And here's the bonus. At the end of every month, we do a drawing, and every Patreon supporter is eligible to win. And what will you win if your name is randomly chosen? Well, you win a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. And every quarter, we'll have a similar drawing where every Patreon supporter is eligible for an annual subscription of the Baker Street Journal. So you get 4 quarterly issues plus the Christmas annual headed your way, courtesy of iHose Media and Trifles. And here's the thing. If you are interested in the Baker Street Journal, this is a particular episode of interest for you, and I'll tell you right now. This episode of Trifles, the first of every month, is one where we do something called Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist. We take a piece of Sherlockian scholarship that may have been overlooked or simply isn't widely accessible to the general public, and we talk about it here with you. And it usually concerns some trifling aspect of the Sherlock Holmes stories. And in this case, Bert, what trifling issue are we talking about in this episode?
We are talking about the tobacco smoked by Dr. Watson. It's not smoked by Sherlock Holmes, who notoriously smokes shag tobacco, which is a dark, thinly cut, generally low-quality tobacco, usually reserved for cigarettes. I think it was largely inexpensive. But Watson, we are told, although we have two tobaccos that are mentioned in association with Watson during the cases of Sherlock Holmes, during all of the 56 short stories and 4 novels. When we meet Watson originally in Study in Scarlet, he says, I always smoke ships myself, because Holmes wants to know if he objects to the smell of strong tobacco. And ships was commonly thought of as being what you might call a cased Virginia, primarily Virginia tobacco that was subjected to pressure and perhaps some flavoring and became a bit sweeter in the process, and was usually sold in a log or a brick, such that, you could carry this about in your pocket if you were a sailor, and you'd take a knife and you would take off a slice and crumble it up, because, it was sort of like if you know the contents of a Fig Newton cookie, it was shit. That sort of pressed Virginia is usually, it actually in a brick. And of course, Aaron Moore used to make that flake tobacco too.
But Bert, I have to caution you and our listeners too. If you are looking to enjoy a Fig Newton, please do not try to smoke it.
I always smoke. Watson, are you still smoking those Fig Newtons of your bachelor days?
Well, and this is interesting, because I always thought that when Watson says, I usually smoke ships myself, it's because, again, when he and Holmes were meeting, this was a couple of months into his recuperation back in London. He had come back on a troop ship, and I figured, well, this must be some kind of tobacco that he picked up on the voyage back from the Far East.
Yeah, I don't think there ever was a tobacco called ships. There may have been, but I think it was generally a euphemism.
Just a style
for that style,
tobacco,
which Dunhill called Navy Flake in the old days. They made a Navy Flake. It's also called a flake tobacco. Anyway, but all of this is, as usual, a complete trifle and a deviation from what we're talking about.
Well, yes, we were talking about the Arcadia Mixture.
Yes,
and this comes up a little later on when in the Adventure of the Crooked Man, Holmes visited Watson at home. Watson was married by this time, and he's having a conversation with him, and he says, you're still smoking the Arcadia Mixture of your bachelor days then. There's no mistaking that fluffy ash on your coat. And we know Holmes was an expert in the identification of tobacco ash. He had that monograph on 140 varieties of tobacco ash. So for him, and obviously, he and Watson lived together, so he knew what Watson's habits were in their bachelor days. But what's interesting here in this article, which I don't know if we mentioned the name of the article, The Secret of the Arcadia Mixture by Robert F. Cairo, Jr. It's from the Baker Street Journal, Volume 50, Number 1, from the spring of 2000. And Mr. Cairo says that in looking at when the Crooked Man took place, that is, when Holmes visited Watson at home and said, you're still smoking the mixture of your bachelor days. Well, obviously, this means Watson's married at this point. And authorities differ. All the chronologists differ as to the dating, but it's typically viewed as having taken place sometime in 1888 or 1889. And it's certainly before 1890. And why is it important, according to Mr. Cairo, that this took place before 1890, Bert?
Well, that is a very good question.
There's a book that's in your library that relates to this, that was published in that year.
Oh, right. Well, that's because, obviously, yes. In 1890, Barrie, who was James M. Barrie, who was the author of Peter Pan and many other things, and who was a friend of Conan Doyle's, published a book called My Lady Nicotine. And of course, in these days, pipe smoking, since the 1850s particularly, had been in a vogue, and blending tobacco and smoking tobacco was a hobby for many people. He published a book entitled My Lady Nicotine, which is a series of, essentially short stories and vignettes about an unnamed narrator's experiences of smoking and smoking events and smoking accoutrements and smoking experiences. And in one of the chapters, chapter 3 of My Lady Nicotine, there's a chapter all about this mystical tobacco, the Arcadia Mixture, which is a beautiful name, but it never, it's one of these things that goes back to the ancient Greek, and it referred to sort of a pastoral vision, harmony with nature, Arcadia. There was never a tobacco marketed in that day called Arcadia, but there was a tobacco, which we have described here in this article, that was Barrie's favorite. He just seldom disclosed what it originally was.
Yeah, and as you were describing Barrie's book, My Lady Nicotine, it was all about short stories related to tobacco. It strikes me that we might have a little difficulty relating to that in 2022. And as you were describing it, as I was thinking about it, we all have our preferences for different things we use on a regular basis, things that might even be addictive in nature. And I thought, the equivalent that we might think of today is if someone put together a publication all about apps on your phone. Right? Because everybody has different apps they use, and yet everybody has a phone. Everybody uses apps. And smoking was so common back then, and everybody had their preferences. They had, whether it's cigarettes, cigars, pipes, and then, of course, they have the different types of tobacco that they enjoyed. So Barrie's write-up of this would be something that would be eminently understandable and ultimately relatable to the reader of 1890.
Yes, that's true. And oddly enough, the way this collection of work begins in Barrie's My Lady Nicotine, he begins with an apology about smoking by way of a preface. Well, it's not really a preface. It's really the first chapter. And, you can tell what's going on here in two ways. First of all, the chapter is entitled Matrimony and Smoking Compared. And the first sentence of this book is, the circumstances in which I gave up smoking were these. And so he describes in his first chapter all of the reasons why he has given up smoking, and he's delighted in matrimonial life, this unnamed narrator. And so he doesn't really miss it. But he then closes this chapter by telling you that, sometimes when my wife has left me after dinner, I wander about the room restlessly like one who misses something. But sometimes she takes me with her to her drawing room and reads aloud her delightfully long home letters or plays soft music to me. And after a time, he says, the music ceases and my wife puts her hand on my shoulder. Perhaps I start a little, and then she says, I've been asleep. Ah, well, this is the book of my dreams. It's all his recollections about smoking.
Well, let's get back to our recollections and make the connection between Watson and James M. Barrie right after this quick word from our sponsor.
Yes, we're in the middle of one of those Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes of Trifles, where we're looking at a classic piece of Sherlockian scholarship. Well, where can you find classic Sherlockian scholarship? Well, there are a couple of places, and we can think of one of them right off the bat that's available right now. It's The Grand Game, Volume 2, which contains Sherlockian scholarship from a variety of sources, mostly the Baker Street Journal, from 1960 to 2010. Volume 2 is all that's left because Volume 1 was so popular, it sold out. We'll have more news on bringing Volume 1 back from the dead in future episodes, but for now, get on over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and pick up your copy of Volume 2 of The Grand Game, covering the last half-century of Sherlockian scholarship. You won't find better work in a single volume anywhere else. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and get The Grand Game Volume 2 today.
And hey, while we're at it, probably just a note here. If you are indeed interested in getting Volume 1 of The Grand Game for your own collection, for your own library, and reading enjoyment, maybe head over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and use the contact button there to let them know that you're interested in it. And of course, you can also email us and we can relay the information to them as well. If you'd like to email us, our email address is trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. And before we jump back into things, I just wanted to make a point to acknowledge some of our most recent Patreon supporters, people who have jumped on board since the beginning of the summer. We have people like Donald and Mickey, Catherine, Chris, Andrew, Christine, Paul, Tim, and Jim. Thank you all for being newfound supporters of Trifles. We appreciate each and every one of you. And stay tuned as your membership ages. You will automatically kind of factor into those levels of thank you gifts, and we will send them out to you. If you'd like to hear your name on the list, along with people like the 9 we just mentioned, we are going to do a monthly acknowledgement. So feel free to join them and others at patreon.com/trifles. Now, Bert, before we do delve back into this interesting connection that Robert F. Cairo Jr. makes between Barry and Watson, I just wanted to note we did talk about tobacco in general, just the smoking habit at 221B, specifically looking at the items that were around the flat. This is a series we did in Season 2 called Inside 221B. We did an episode called Where There's Smoke, episode number 71. We'll have a link in the show notes to that if you'd like to listen to that companion episode as well. So where do we stand in terms of Holmes's identification of Arcadia, knowing that Watson smoked ships in 1881 when the two of them got together? Where does that leave us?
Well, basically, it leaves us sort of unraveling the links here. Our author, as you appropriately point out, Robert F. Cairo Jr. in The Secret of the Arcadia Mixture, says that, clearly what was going on here is that when they were talking about tobacco, Watson mentioned the correct name of the Arcadia Mixture, and before publication, they just changed it to Arcadia, which was Barry's euphemism for this. But the actual tobacco was made by a company called Carreras of London, and it was a mixture called Craven Mixture. And it had been marketed, as I recall, with at least, many years ago, say 40, 50 years ago, it's no longer manufactured. I don't know what became of the Carreras company. But the cans had a pink label and a black cat and a slogan, "Supreme since the 60s." Well, that actually referred to the 1860s. So it had been around for a long while. And it's what, if you're familiar at all with pipe smoking materials and tobacco blends and so on, you would call an English mixture. Which is a blend of several different tobaccos, Burley, Virginia, but with a preponderance of what they would then call Oriental tobaccos like Perique and Latakia. And the exact proportions of the different tobaccos used in putting this together, of course, were deep secret. And so therefore, no one wanted to disclose what the actual mixture was. And that made it very exclusive.
I like that. And, you can just imagine J.M. Barrie's wife trying to get him to quit smoking. You and that craven addiction. It's an unfortunate name for anyone who wishes to keep it up. But so the question then comes, how did Watson and J.M. Barrie get to know each other? And Cairo actually runs through this in a pretty interesting way. He says they obviously don't admit to knowing each other. And by the way, folks, the whole premise here that Cairo sticks very closely to is the Sherlockian game of understanding that Watson was not a literary figure. He was a real figure, and his quote-unquote creator was not his creator at all, but his literary agent, Conan Doyle. And that's the premise that Cairo connects here. And he says, we do know that the literary agent and Barrie were close friends and collaborators, and it would have been natural for Doyle to have introduced Watson to Barrie. And, the very stand-up, stalwart fellow. And it's Cairo's supposition that Watson switched his brand of pipe tobacco in 1886. So this would have been after the 1881 meeting of Holmes and Watson, where Watson admits to smoking ships, and before Holmes visited Watson in 1888 or 1889 during The Crooked Man, where he makes that remark about Watson smoking the tobacco of his bachelor days, the Arcadia Mixture. And in doing so, Cairo says, this was actually a form of a congratulatory gift to Watson, newly minted as an author, having submitted his manuscript for a study in scarlet, and Barrie was congratulating this friend that Doyle had introduced him to with a gift of the Craven or Arcadia mixture.
Yeah, perfectly reasonable.
Yeah. Then he wonders, were Barrie and Sherlock Holmes friends at that point? He says, more research is needed, but I tentatively postulate that there was no friendship between these two men. Once again, the answer is in the tobacco. Holmes preferred strong black shag, as you noted before, Bert, and was only once shown to be smoking the Arcadia mixture in any of the published accounts left to us. However, this was a special case. Holmes hadn't seen Watson for some time, and Holmes desired to share some of Watson's tobacco while they smoked in companionable silence, and that was indeed in The Crooked Man.
Well, it's interesting. There are these, many connections between Barrie and Conan Doyle, some of which, you've mentioned. They did collaborate, most notably in an extremely unsuccessful operetta. And that was actually the result of a pretty comic piece, I think, that Barrie then wrote about that particular failure, in which he lampooned Sherlock Holmes a bit, which is really fun to read. And then, of course, both Conan Doyle and Barrie were great cricketers, and sadly and almost inexcusably, we don't have any sense of Holmes as playing cricket, which is very un-English, very unlikely. In fact, we don't have any direct evidence Watson played cricket. And in fact, there's no appearance really of cricket in the Holmes cases, which is a bit peculiar. But Conan Doyle was on one of Barrie's cricket teams.
He was indeed, and we know Conan Doyle actually wrote a story or parts of a story while at a cricket match. So it's not unheard of that Conan Doyle would have taken this in. But let's recall too, Bert, that there is one instance of cricket mentioned in the Sherlock Holmes stories. That is, Watson recalling in the naval treaty when Holmes gets the letter from Percy Phelps, Tadpole Phelps, that they used to whack him across the shins with a cricket bat in school. So, but, if anyone is interested in seeing that J.M. Barrie, Conan Doyle collaboration, we would simply say, you've got to be smoking something. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
My God. Have you got a cold, Watson?
Oh, it's this poisonous atmosphere.
This is a bit thick, I suppose.
Thick! It's intolerable.